It is somewhat daunting to give a Shabbat Hagadol drasha in general. It used to be one of the few times a rabbi would speak during the year, Shabbat Hagadol and Shabbat Shuvah. Maybe it's easier in an empty sanctuary. I think it's harder, less of an ability to interact with people. But here I am, my first Shabbat Hagadol drasha as rabbi of the Jewish Center of Atlantic Beach. And it's wonderful to be speaking to you, with you. I had a chance to give this in person on Shabbos morning, and now I have the opportunity to record and send it out. I'm recording on Friday afternoon, and so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. There's a lot of discussion at this time as we thankfully are moving towards more of a return to normal. Thank God the vaccine, more people are getting vaccinated. We have an eye towards coming back. There's a lot of conversation about what's shul going to be like. And I do not have all the answers yet, but there is a sense that things have changed. Back in the fall, the journal Conversations, which comes out from the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, published the issue about shul, prayer, what's it going to be like, changes and the like. And there was an article by Edward Hoffman entitled Reempowering the Synagogue, a Maslowian Perspective. And Hoffman talked about how can we redefine synagogues today to fit changing Jewish needs. People are connecting to shuls differently. Certainly in the last year, people have spent a lot less time in shul for the most part. Alternatives have come up, backyard minyanim, Zoom, and the like. So it's an appropriate time to try and understand what shul should be about. And he invokes Avraham and Avraham's tent as a terrific model for the shul. And he goes on to write about, in modern day America, another Abraham has given the world many worthy ideas for social improvement. And he's talking about psychologist Abraham Abe Maslow. Born in New York City in 1908, he became one of the country's most influential psychologists and thinkers. And he popularized such terms as self-actualization, peak experience, and synergy, and is very well known for his concept of the hierarchy of inborn needs. In essence, he argued that basic to all humans everywhere are 6 sets of psychological needs for physical safety, belongingness, self-esteem, respect, love, and spiritual fulfillment. And goes on to discuss how these needs can be found in the way we relate to synagogues. Since we are standing a week before Pesach, I'd like to use the Seder as an opportunity to explore what are some important lessons, values, and activities for the successful synagogue. As a rabbi for almost 20 years, I strongly believe in the need for creating a synagogue, the shul experience, which is meant to be open and accessible with many portals and on-ramps for all. And if we look at our Pesach experience, in particular the Seder, we can find foundation, inspiration, and pathways to a successful synagogue. And I want to start with an idea developed by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. The Rav talks about the difference between the mitzvah of Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim, remembering the Exodus, and Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the mitzvah on Seder night to tell the story of the Exodus. In source number 1, the Rambam in the laws of Kriyat Shema, he mentions that there's mitzvah lahazkir Yetziat Mitzrayim. We have an obligation to mention the Exodus. We do that in Shema. In the 3rd paragraph of Shema, in morning and evening, we say, reference the idea of God taking us out of Egypt. When discussing a mitzvah on the Seder night, the Rambam, source number 2, talks about Shetzivanu lissaper b'yitziat Mitzrayim, B'leil Chamisha Asar Nisan. It's a mitzvah to tell the story about the Exodus from Egypt on the 15th night of Nisan. and goes on to describe that it should be done eloquently, and it should be done with discussion and description, and this is the mitzvah of the Seder experience. And the Rambam further explains, source number 3 in the laws of Chametz Umatzah, that the mitzvah is l'saper b'nisim v'niflaot shenasu la'avotenu b'Mitzrayim. Talk about the miracles, praise the miracles. And this is because of the responsibility, as spelled out in the Torah, Zachor et hayom hazeh asher yitzatem miMitzrayim. Remember the day you left Egypt. And the Rambam compares this with Zachor et yom hashabat l'kadsho. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Rav Soloveitchik notes that we have here a mitzvah to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim and to tell Yetziat Mitzrayim. What is the difference predicated upon? How can it be understood? The Rav says, look at how the Rambam described the mitzvah to tell the story. The mitzvah to tell the story is learned from Shabbos. The word Zachor and Zachor. What's special about that word Zachor? It's a command to remember, but not just to remember once. Zachor is something that there's a requirement to remember continually, constantly, in a special format. Remembering Shabbos isn't about saying it's Shabbos. It's a week-long experience. From that pasuk we learn about the idea not only of Kiddush, not only of sanctity, but we learn about the idea of each day of the week being counted from Shabbos. So Rav Soloveitchik explains the mitzvah to remember the Exodus can be accomplished with a statement. I remember the Exodus. The mitzvah l'saper, sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, to tell the story, is not just once upon a time we were slaves in Egypt. The mitzvah to tell a story is something that is much more all-encompassing. It's something that involves a lot more effort, more activity, more symbolism. It involves the grandeur and the glory of the exalted evening, which is the Seder night. And Rav Soloveitchik returned to this theme a number of times in halachic analyses of the Seder and in explaining the beauty of the Seder. There's an article that was published in the Yeshiva University Haggadah, 9 aspects of the Seder experience. So I'd like to share 9 aspects from the Seder experience which can shed light and inspire us into what it takes to create a successful synagogue, a successful shul community. And on the source sheets, they're spelled out in Roman numerals with some sources which I'll be referring to. And feel free to examine them more closely. And I welcome your feedback and your comments and questions. The first important lesson from the Seder, which can inform our shul experience, is one of chesed, kindness, concern for others. The Gemara, as also formulated by the Rambam, source 4, says, "Afilu ani hamafarnes min hatzdaka lo yivchatu lo me'arba kosot." Even a poor person has to have the 4 cups of wine for the Seder. From here we have a principle that those congregations, those shuls that say Kiddush on Friday night, don't say Kiddush on Seder night. Because the origins of Kiddush in the shul on Friday night is for the guests that are around who don't have Kiddush otherwise. However, on the Seder night, everyone is meant to have a place for the Seder. Everyone is meant to have the wine they need for the Seder, because there's an obligation to ensure that everyone has what they need for Pesach. This is the source of the mitzvah of Moschitim, the Passover relief funds, in which we are ensuring that people have what they need to celebrate Pesach the way we like to celebrate Pesach. This Pesach chesed goes even deeper. When we begin the Seder, we begin classically with Halach Ma'anya, that Aramaic passage, people sing it, which includes the expression, Kol dichvin yete v'yechol, kol ditzrich yete v'yifsach. Anyone who is hungry, anyone who is famished, source 5, should come and eat. Anyone who is in need should come and partake of the Pesach sacrifice. Why can't it just say anyone who's hungry come and eat? Why does it have to say anyone who is hungry and those who are in need? Rav Soloveitchik explained that we are concerned not only with people's physical hunger, but also their spiritual and their emotional hunger. It's not only about the food, but it's about the friendship. It's about being able to create warm feelings of connection. And so, just like the Seder, it begins with a theme of reaching out to others, supporting others. A shul must have built into its DNA, built into its kishkas, the idea of concern, of connection to the well-being of others. It may not necessarily be material, but it can be emotional, it can be spiritual, it can be creating friendships. It can be getting to know someone that you don't know yet. Seeing a face you don't recognize, how are you, who are you? Getting to know the other person. A Seder lesson for a successful synagogue is the idea of chesed. A second idea is the focus and the emphasis on youth. I believe that children are our future. That's how the song goes. It's essential for a shul to be focused on and responsive to and engaging youth. And it's true, there are people who are young at all ages, and that's also important. But as the Rambam teaches with regard to the Seder, that at the Seder one has to introduce changes. Sarich lasot shinoi kidei sheyiru habanim v'yishalu. You're doing things specifically that the kids will ask. So much of the Seder, the orchatz, the karpas, the yachatz, the afikomen, a lot of these things are done just to get a question, to get a rise in the curiosity from our children, to engage them. The Talmud talks about it. It's a time to give them nuts and candies, to keep them awake, to keep them engaged. That's the Seder night. That's the future of the Jewish people, engaging our young people. And a shul, to be successful, must be concerned with and focused on and invest time and resources and energy to engage young people. That is the future for the Jewish people. That's certainly the future for a shul. A third lesson for a strategy for a successful synagogue. It's the idea of being open to all. Engaging all people, all Jews, all levels of observance. At the Seder, we learn this lesson from the fact that there are children at the table, the 4 sons, the 4 children of different abilities. The Rambam makes mention of them in source number 8, that there's a mitzvah to teach the children, inform the children, afilu lo sho'alu, even if they don't ask. And he talks about the wise son who has some intellectual curiosity. He talks about the katano tipesh, the child who might be small or foolish or uninterested. And from here we are all familiar with the Haggadah's examples of the chacham, the rasha, the tam, and the she'eino yodea lish'ol. It's important to engage anyone and everyone at the Seder. A successful synagogue is interested in all of the Jews that are in its area. People call this outreach, people call this engagement, it's called kiruv. A successful synagogue has its doors wide open, including to and maybe especially those Jews who come from different backgrounds or different denominations and different levels of understanding. Source number 9, Rav Lichtenstein talks about in his classic intellectual way. Does anyone imagine that if every non-Orthodox temple were to shut down forthwith, that on the morrow the membership would flock en masse to the nearest shul or shtibel? Are all non-Orthodox Jews going to come to an Orthodox synagogue just because their synagogues close? If we indeed temple attendance and affiliation are waning, and on the assumption that the absentees are beyond the reach of our own message, is there not beyond competition as much cause for dismay as for gratification? If we're concerned as we ought to be about the future spiritual destiny of our siblings, and if we are convinced that in certain areas a measure of comedy would enhance it, might the option not be at least worthy of consideration? We should be concerned with the level of engagement of those Jews who aren't attending the Orthodox synagogue and find ways to encourage them to affiliate, to associate, to deepen their connection to Judaism. And I think a very beautiful expression of this idea is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe's discussion of the 5th son. In a letter from 1957, right before Pesach, the Rebbe wrote about, in our time of confusion and obscurity, there's another kind of a Jewish child, the child who is conspicuous by his absence from the Seder service. The one who has no interest whatsoever in Torah and mitzvot, laws and customs, who's not even aware of the Seder Shel Pesach, of the Exodus from Egypt and the subsequent revelation at Sinai. We have the 4 children at the table. There's the one who's not even showing up. And the Rebbe goes on to discuss the seriousness of the challenge, as well as the opportunity to rise to that challenge. There's no room for hopelessness in Jewish life, and no Jew should ever be given up as a lost cause. through the proper, compassionate approach of Ahavat Yisrael, even those of the lost generation can be brought back to the love of God and the love of Torah, and not only be included in the community of the four sons, but in due course be elevated to the rank of the wise son. And this sounds, as we're familiar with, the classic approach of Chabad to reach out to every Jew. But it's not only Chabad's responsibility. Each and every one of us has the ability to engage and reach out. A successful synagogue is one that is ready, willing, and able to engage all Jews at all levels and bring them closer. There's a fourth component that we see from the Seder that can help a shul thrive. It's important for each and every person to try and share your talent. The Rambam writes, and we see it in the Haggadah, Afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu nuvonim, kulanu zukenim, kulanu yodim es haTorah. Doesn't matter if we're all sages, if we're all wise, we're all smart, we're all old, we're all ages. It's all about the Exodus discussion is for everyone. Doesn't matter where you come from. In a shul, gathered in our community of people of all sorts of different talents and abilities. People who can read the Torah, people who can teach a class, people who can run an event, people who can lead a chesed drive, people who can make a minyan, people who can come to daven and create a larger audience or community. Men, women, children of all ages have an opportunity to participate. And a successful shul is one where people do participate and give of themselves and of their talents to create a more vibrant sanctuary, sacred space for all to benefit from. A fifth lesson from the Seder. The Rambam teaches that from the Talmud that the story of the Seder is told not only as a story, v'hu sheyidrosh me'arami oved avi ad sheyigmor kol haparsha, that we read these verses and we give a drasha, Shabbat Hagadol drasha. We investigate, we explicate, we expound. It's not just an experience of words or even just a teaching, we delve deeply. This is the idea of Talmud Torah. Torah study is an element at the Seder. Torah study is a critical element in the shul environment, in the experience. As we say in the Haggadah, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, blessed is the place, blessed is God, the source of all blessing. Baruch Shenatan Torah Li'amu Yisrael Baruch Hu. God is the source of all blessing who gave us the Torah. Rav Soloveitchik discusses that in a way this is the Birchot HaTorah. We're saying a bracha on studying Torah, the studying Torah that's taking place at the Seder. A successful synagogue is also a place of Torah. That place of Torah is reflected in the Beit Midrash, full of Sfarim. That Torah is reflected in Shiurim, in the learned lessons that are taught by the rabbis and by lay people. But it's about reinforcing the message that each of us has a responsibility to study and to know more, to increase our level of learning. We have people who are studying Daf Yomi, we have people who are studying Parsha, people studying Mishnah. Take some piece of the Torah and make it a daily experience in which we can grow. Thank God we live in an era where there's so many resources. Torah Anytime, Daf Yomi, Mishnah Yomi, websites, lists. Torah is essential to the Seder experience. Torah is essential to the shul experience. Going with Torah is the idea of mitzvah, the idea of obligation. We read in the Seder about Rabban Gamliel. It's captured by the Rambam. Kol mi shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu belel chamisha asar lo yasa yedecho vato. Right? You don't say these three things, you didn't accomplish the goal. You didn't fulfill the obligation. Pesach, matzah, maror. You have to mention these things. You have to explain these things. There's obligation. We are a people, a tradition, a religion of mitzvah. Mitzvah means obligation. And it's impossible to be a successful synagogue, a successful congregation, without remembering the fact that to be a Jew is to fulfill our mission, our marching orders from the commander-in-chief, and that mitzvah and obligation and tradition are part of who we are, a part of our religious experience. And while we are fulfilling our mitzvot, while we are fulfilling our mission, while we are studying our Torah, it's critical that we make it relevant for contemporary times. Source number 16, the Rambam very famously invokes language that's used in the Haggadah. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam laharot et atzmo, ki'ilu hu bi'atzmo yatsa ata mishibud Mitzrayim. In the Haggadah, we're used to it saying, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo. The Rambam has a slightly different text, that a person has to show themselves, to view themselves as if they've personally come out of Egypt. The idea that ki'ilu ata ba'atzmecha hayita eved v'yatzata l'cherut v'nifdeta. You yourselves were a slave, and now you have become free. It's the experiential nature of the Seder which makes it so beautiful, so unique. It's an element that really differentiates Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling the story, from Zechira, from remembering the Exodus. We remember it happened, we mention that it happened. When we tell the story, we're putting ourselves in the experience. So much of making Judaism meaningful is to find a way to make it relevant. That the experience should be relevant. When we study Torah, we make it relevant. When we perform mitzvot, we make them relevant. We are able to grapple with the issues of the day. That's really one of the elements that distinguish the modern Orthodox community. It's the commitment to the tradition, but its ability to fully grapple with modernity. In many ways, that's the biggest challenge of the day, because it introduces outside elements which can be very challenging, which can lead to questions. But nevertheless, it leads to a slippery slope. That's why I say, to be modern Orthodox, one has to have sturdy shoes. The idea of making Judaism relevant, seeing ourselves as part of the narrative. We learn that from the Seder. Everyone's different customs. You walk around the table, you sing songs, you tell histories. It's about making ourselves part of the story, seeing ourselves as essential to the continuation of the story. If we look at one of the important parts of the Seder, and it's definitely an important part of Shul, we're on the last page of sources at the top. Food, right? As one rabbi liked to say, the most important words to promote and advertise any synagogue event, right? Food will follow. Kiddush following services. And at the Seder is not just the telling of the story and the rituals and the experience. As the Rambam writes, Leficha, kishesoed adam b'layla hazeh tzarich lechol v'lishtot v'hu mesev derech herut. The Rambam is talking about reclining, but he highlights that when a person is eating on that night, when a person is drinking on that night, it's to feel part of the freedom. It's not that it's freedom. Eating and drinking is part of that experience. It's important to recognize that Shulchan Aruch, the meal, right? Of course, when do we eat is the classic question, but the meal that is experienced at the Seder, that's part of the experience. That's part of fulfilling the mitzvah Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. We have a separate mitzvah to eat matzah and maror, but the eating at the Seder, and the Rambam points this out, eating your meal while reclining is also part of experiencing the freedom of the exodus of Egypt. There's a part of the Haggadah, V'hi she'amda lavotenu v'lanu. Number of beautiful songs to these words. V'hi she'amda lavotenu v'lanu. It is this that has stood for our ancestors and for us. And the passage goes on to point out that many have tried to stop us and destroy us, but God has rescued us from their hands. From a grammatical perspective, V'hi means, and it is this. So what's the this? V'hi she'amda. This has stood for us and our ancestors. What's the this? So some say it's God's protection. Some say it's our faith in God's protection, or our faith in God to save us. Some look at the word V'hi, Vav, He, Yud, Aleph. Vav, 6, stands for the 6 orders of the Mishnah. He, 5, the 5 books of the Torah. Yud, 10, the 10 commandments. And as we sing at the end of the Seder, one is Hashem, One is Hashem, in the heavens and the earth. Right? That's as much singing as you'll get right now. It's our Judaism that stood up there. Great interpretation that resonates with me that I learned at Seder growing up from my father. We're holding up the wine glass as we say V'hi She'amda. V'hi She'amda. It's our ability to continue to celebrate in the face of adversity. It's the l'chaim, it's the celebration that is part and parcel of our existence. The fact that the Seder, the food is important, the wine is important, it's part of who we are. It's obviously food is an important part to Judaism, but food is an important ingredient in the synagogue life as well. Whether it be the Kiddush, whether it be communal meals, whether it be inviting each other for opportunities to experience Shabbat meals together in homes when that's possible. It's all about the food, not just the eating that comes from the food, but the spiritual connections that comes from that as well. It's just interesting. I saw an article earlier in the month about how kosher wine survived 2020. And obviously a lot of industries have been impacted, and they're talking to Adam Montefiore, an Israeli wine industry consultant. And amidst all this disruption, he points out there's good news. Israelis have learned to drink at home, to have wine as part of their home routine, understanding that it's okay to drink wine at home and share it with their family. And just the quote stood out. Obviously, everything in moderation, but it's our ability to break bread together, to say l'chaim together, to come together in celebration around food, which is a key part to a successful synagogue. Number 9, and there are obviously other steps that are important, other successful strategies, but I think that it's important to learn that just like at the Seder, we are connecting to previous generations. Right? I have a custom at my Seder to wear the kittel that I inherited from my late grandfather. People have certain recipes. We use the Kiddush cup that was the Kiddush cup at the bris of another grandfather of blessed memory. It's the connection that it all comes together. It's much more than a person, than a family, even than a community. We are most successful when we connect and operate together as part of the totality of what's called Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik has an article, The Synagogue as an Institution and as an Idea. And he points to a fascinating Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Lamed Bet, Amud Aleph, where Rabbi Yishmael says there are 2 sins, on account of 2 sins, that the Amei Haratzot, the ignoramuses, the unlearned, they make these mistakes and it causes them to die young, the Gemara says. What are the 2 sins for which they are punished? Shekorin la'aron hakodesh arana. They call the Holy Ark just an ark. The Holy Ark is viewed as simply an ark. And we can appreciate there's something wrong with taking away the sanctity of the Holy Ark. It's okay to call it the Aron Kodesh. I think it's about not having the appreciation much more than the words. And what's the other sin? Because they call the Beit Knesset Beit Am. They call the synagogue the house of the people. You can't look at a shul as merely a place where people gather. And Rav Soloveitchik says it very beautifully. Right? The halacha is so meticulous regarding the name Beit Knesset. Why? What's wrong with calling the space Beit Am, a place where people gather? Why did our sages say it's a serious offense to substitute Beit Am for Beit HaKnesset? The answer is simple. The Beit HaKnesset is the home of the great invisible Knesset Yisrael, which cuts through all the ages and all millennia. It's not just about us. A Beit Am, a place for people, is just a house for contemporaries. However, to pray with contemporaries is not enough. One must pray with the entire covenantal community which is present in the Beit HaKnesset. And the sanctity of the Beit HaKnesset is due to that mysterium tremendum. The latter suspends all 3 time dimensions. The past is not gone yet. The future has already arrived. And we, the 10 people, the minyan, those of us sitting in the pews who live in the present, unite both past, present, and future. A Beit Knesset is the home of prayer, as was pointed out. because it is the home where Almighty has a rendezvous with the Knesset Yisrael, the people of Israel. There are many strategies and ingredients to the successful synagogue, and the Seder has provided us with a springboard to explore many of them. The importance of care and concern for other people, focused on the future of the youth, focused on the need to be sensitive towards and engaging to those who aren't part of our community, who aren't yet sitting in the pews. Each of us should share our talents. Each of us has to remember the importance of a shul being dedicated to Torah, to mitzvah, while remaining relevant for the contemporary times. Let's not forget about the importance of food. But what really creates a successful synagogue, just like a successful Seder experience, is our realization that we are the sum total of something much larger than ourselves. When we may not like necessarily everything about the synagogue, if we don't like necessarily our seat, if we don't like necessarily the schedule of services or the order of classes, or even, alas, you don't like the sermon of the rabbi or the different policies of the person sitting next to you, we're part of something much larger, which brings us together. We're part of something larger that brings us together physically as members of a synagogue, as Jews. We're part of something much larger than our corner of, geographically speaking, our corner of Long Island or our corner of the space we occupy in the Orthodox or modern Orthodox community. I love the way Rav Soloveitchik uses the term mysterium tremendum, tremendous mystery. Right? It doesn't make so much sense how we could all stay together, come together, live together, daven together, speak together, have kiddush together. But if we appreciate our role in the giant experience of the Jewish people, we can understand that that is what brings us together. So as we sit down next week for our Seder and find meaning and relevance in all of its many experiences, in the multimedia, audio-visual explanations and stories and recipes and wine, matzah, maror, and all the rest, we can think about how these are examples and guidelines for how, please God, we will make our community stronger. Please God, we will be returning more to life that existed before we were separated. And as we come back to shul, we can think about, reimagine how to make our community, how to make the Jewish Center of Atlantic Beach a model, a shining light for all that a shul should be, for all that the Jewish community should be. I wish everyone a Chag Kosher v'Sameach, a joyous and meaningful Pesach holiday experience.